All right, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Still a solid crowd. We know how warm it is outside, so we appreciate so many of you to make the trek down here. If it gets too warm, we have free water in the back, so feel free to grab as much of that as you need. And if it's the first time here at the Frontline Club, maybe consider following us on social media or look at our website or at our other events. We've still got 1 month open before we close for a month in August for the heats, and then we'll be back in September. So there's a few more events coming up, and all of them very exciting, of course. And if it's not your first time, well then, why aren't you a member yet? It's only £1 a day. Don't think about that too much. And you get to support independent journalism and us organizing events like these with people like that. I'm particularly excited today as I have some friends on the panel, and I think it's going to be a particularly exciting discussion. So without further ado, I give over to the panel.
Great, Martin, thank you very much. Do I mention the heat as Martin did? I feel like saying, before I say anything else, thank you for coming out in this heat. This is sort of the London summer equivalent, I guess, of coming through a massive blizzard and making your way to the Frontline Club. So thank you for walking or taking a bus or riding the tube and getting here through that sort of experience. We're very grateful to you diehards for coming out. Tonight's main event is a discussion on U.S.-Asia relations, a new era of rivalry and realignment. My name is Charles Hecker, and I'm your moderator for this evening. I'm actually a Russianist by training, but for my sins, I've done a few years as a geopolitical risk consultant and as an author. We're going to spend 90 minutes, plus or minus, together, and for about half of that time, so keep me on the clock, for about half that time, we're going to be hearing from our panelists, and for the balance of that time, we're going to take Q&A from the audience, so please do prepare your thoughts and your questions in advance. Before we get started in earnest, let me take a moment to introduce our panelists. Sitting next to me here is Stephanie Baker. Stephanie is a senior writer on the investigations team at Bloomberg News Businessweek, based in London, and is the author of Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia, published by Scribner and Simon & Schuster in the US and HarperCollins in the UK. She's a veteran journalist who began her career in Moscow in the 1990s. We just established that we missed each other by just a few months. I left the Moscow Times in 1996. Stephanie joined the Moscow Times in 1996. I've read Stephanie's book. It's superb. Pick it up as soon as you can. Stephanie, welcome. Next to Stephanie is Vincent Ni. Vincent is the Asia editor at NPR in Washington, D.C., where he leads coverage of the region's politics, economics, and international affairs. Vincent, it's an absolute pleasure to have you this evening. You've just come from Norway, haven't you?
Yes.
Was it warm or cold in Norway?
It was reasonable.
Okay, reasonable sounds nice. And finally, at the very end, closest to the air conditioning, is Isabel Hilton. Isabel Hilton is a writer and broadcaster with a particular expertise on China. She founded the China Dialogue Trust in 2006, developing strategy, growing a worldwide readership, and developing workshops and field-building events. She's currently visiting professor at KCL's Lau Institute and a contributing editor to Prospect magazine. Welcome, Isabel. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground this evening, and we'll be touching on economic themes and security themes and geopolitical topics over the course of the conversation. Because I suppose, after all, what we're talking about here tonight is not really just the rivalry between two countries, the US and China, or between the US and an entire region, but we're talking about the evolution, the very painful and very disruptive evolution of the global order. And so if there's an underlying theme to everything that we're going to talk about tonight, I think that's what we'll touch on from time to time. Before we get into all of that, I think we'll start with a lightning round on just sort of how things look and feel in this rivalry, whether it's regional or nation to nation, just how it all feels today. Isabel, would you like to start?
Not today. US-China, we're in a sort of truce at the moment in the tariff wars, but we don't have a deal. Trump keeps announcing there's a deal, there isn't a deal. So this is very much a kind of ceasefire, but we haven't got a peace agreement. So we don't know how that's going to go. But in the first rounds of hostilities, China did bare its teeth, and Trump, who likes to tell other people that they don't have cards, found that he didn't have all the cards either. So China's biggest card is rare earths. They started slow walking all the strategic minerals and rare earths, and you could hear howls of pain beginning kind of across the United States. So Trump is not going to have it all his own way. The Chinese have learned that if you kind of play tough back, that he will back down. So that's the next round that we can wait for. Meanwhile, I think it's fair to say that the United States has alienated almost every ally in the region, not least by slapping tariffs on them and then refusing to talk. They've got something like 90 deals to do before July 9th.
90 deals in 90 days.
90 deals in 90 days. And who could possibly doubt that that's going to work, right? Exactly. So that's where we are. We're in chaos. Meanwhile, they're trying to shove through this enormous budget deal at home, which is going to cause domestic havoc. So it's pretty sticky, and I don't see it getting better easily for the foreseeable future.
Vincent, you're normally in Washington, D.C. So from your perspective there, and as a regional expert, what's your hot take?
Well, I think, first of all, I agree with everything Isabel said. I think, what is being said by the President of the United States really matters. But what is not said by this administration also matters. What is not being said these days. If you think about 4 years of the Biden administration, there was a lot of emphasis on democracy versus autocracy, right? There was a lot of emphasis on rules-based international order or regional order. These sort of, discourses have all but disappeared largely in this administration. And I think that matters to the region if we are talking about this Asia vast, complex region. And allies, friends, foes, they're all looking for signals from Washington. And what is not being said is also something that they take cue from. Right? If you think about what China is doing these days, they've been thinking about how to reassert and re-emphasize its dominance in the region. And what does that mean for Taiwan, for example, right? And also for allies, Japan, South Korea. If you have tariffs being slapped on these allies, what does that mean for their security alliance with the United States? And by the way, the president also threatening to pull troops out of the Korean Peninsula. And what does that mean for North Korea dynamics with South Korea? All of these countries are taking cues from Washington, D.C. And what is not being said is perhaps even more important than what is being said if we are thinking about what is going to happen next.
Great, Vincent. Thank you. Stephanie, before we jump into the economic block, how about a hot take?
Right. So, in addition to writing about Russia, part of my book covered the so-called Asian roundabout, how Russia has used Asian countries to smuggle goods into Russia in violation of U.S. export controls and sanctions. And I also covered the Trump administration in the first term and comments on at Bloomberg. I mean, my big take is that Trump's goal is to reduce the U.S. deficit that he sees as the world is ripping off the U.S. And I think that's the wrong way to see it. Actually, the trade deficit, the U.S. trade deficit, is a sign of America's success, that it's the wealthiest country in the world. It's able to import from poorer countries that don't have the purchasing power to buy U.S. goods, and therefore they do have this trade imbalance. He is obviously ripping up the international rules-based order, ripping up the World Trade Order that the U.S. helped to build, and his overall goal of trying to reshore manufacturing to the U.S. and rebalance the trade deficit is going to fail ultimately. And if we wake up in 3 years, I think he will not have succeeded on his goals of either reducing the deficit or increasing U.S. manufacturing. And I think the deal with China is very telling insofar as he says he's got a deal, doesn't release the details. Apparently, China has agreed to make it easier for the U.S. to import rare earth minerals and magnets. Besant just said today that he didn't think China had done enough on that front. We don't know what the U.S. has given in return. And so I think this is going to be a very opaque, volatile period that will go on for months, regardless of the July 9th deadline.
This is exactly the sort of period that I wouldn't mind sleeping through for the next 3 years. If we do wake up when it's all over, let me know how it looks. So we've tariffs, trade. So let's jump briefly into the economics block, which is probably, judging by 3 hot takes, the most prominent current theme in the relationship between the United States and China and the rest of Asia. We are 8 days away from the deadline that Trump imposed on, Liberation Day in the White House Rose Garden, which was on April 2 of this year. And I can't help but think that he intentionally avoided making this announcement on April 1st, which is April Fool's Day. Because, making that sort of announcement that really sort of defies global logic, global trade and sort of rational economic logic, perhaps announcing it on April 1st would have been a much better idea, but he skipped April Fool's Day and he announced it on April 2nd. Anyway, the deadline is July 9th. Stephanie, sticking with you for now, is everyone familiar with the Trump taco? Trump always, okay, great. So, coined by Robert Armstrong, I think, in the Financial Times. Stephanie, is Trump going to do a taco?
It depends on who gets in his ear towards July 9th, I think. Remember, he went about this, he announced the pause in the Liberation Day tariffs only because Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, managed to get into the White House at a time when Peter Navarro, his trade advisor, happened to be at another meeting and convinced him that the market chaos was absolutely unsustainable and that he had to pause. So who wins this battle? Is Navarro in his ear, muttering away, saying, we're going to do all these great deals, or does Bessent and Lutnick win out? Clearly, Lutnick's promise of 90 deals in 90 days is not going to happen. As my Bloomberg colleagues recently coined it, they'll more likely end up with a dirty dozen. And these will not be trade deals in the traditional sense of how we think of trade deals. These will be tariff agreements, frameworks without a lot of details and probably subject to change as they go on. And I think that whatever happens, we'll end up with tariffs that are probably 3 to 4 times higher than they were under the Biden administration, regardless. And that's going to have huge global economic consequences. I think the China deal is instructive in terms of that there won't be a lot of disclosure. Obviously, these other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, don't have the kind of leverage that China has been able to make clear because China has these rare earth minerals. It's used that very effectively to try to negotiate a deal. The likes of Vietnam don't really have that kind of bargaining power. And they can't really offer to buy more U.S. goods because they just don't have the purchasing power to do that. So, Vietnam tariffs at 46% potentially if they don't reach a deal. Obviously, Vietnam has been used by Chinese manufacturers to get around some of the tariffs earlier. So I think it's going to be a very rocky ride. And frankly, if you step back and look at this, there are too many tariffs. I mean, Howard Lutnick can't even keep track of where we're at. So I don't think this is good for global trade. He has ripped up the global trade order. To borrow the title of your book, he views trade as a zero-sum game.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
This is not free trade that benefits everyone. I think in this case, everyone will lose. And he will just try to pursue this sort of transactional policy in the false belief that actually it will help the U.S. when in fact I think it will hurt the U.S.
The scary thing, Stephanie, thank you for that. I mean, the scary thing about all of this is it reminds us a little bit of what was going on in Trump 1.0, and that is whoever was last in the Oval Office would dictate what he did and what policy was. Isabel, China is a driver of global economics and the global economy, but it's also a sort of a recipient of things that happen to it. economically. So, how does this work on China's underlying economics? How does that play out in the short and medium term? And how does China set its own economic policy when it's sort of having to respond in this ad hoc basis to what comes out of the United States?
Yeah, I think that in terms of responding to what comes out of the United States, that's sort of marginal at this point, because economic policy is set every 5 years. It's, it's a very iterative process. It's not easily changed. That said, in terms of where the Chinese economy is, it's not in a great place. It had all those years of double-digit growth, which then, of course, in the course of events, slows down. They then started to move up the value chain, up the technology chain around 2013, 2014, went for transition technologies, so all the renewables, everything to do with climate change, which they now dominate. However, at the same time, they about 40% of their added GDP growth in that boom time came from pouring concrete, essentially. So this was building infrastructure, some of which was necessary, some of it not so much. There was an infrastructure deficit, so there was a lot to do. And then, particularly for provincial governments, who were always short of cash because Beijing kind of tended to take it all and not give them enough back. So they made up the deficit by essentially seizing land, rezoning it, borrowing money, pouring concrete, and selling the results. And that worked until it didn't. And so we now have enough spare apartments in China, which will never be lived in, to house the entire population of the United Kingdom. So if anyone has a housing problem,
Seriously.
I can put you in touch with someone. Those will never be lived in because the population has peaked and is falling, and also because there was nowhere to put your savings that got you any return. So the middle classes bought apartments. So I know people who have 2 or 3 apartments because the prices kept going up. So, hey, that's what you did. And so this situation has destroyed a lot of middle class wealth. The result of that is that the ambition to grow a much bigger consumer economy is having a hard time. So what drives the Chinese economy now? They've lost the pouring concrete bonus. The middle classes are a bit anxious. The population's aging, so there are bigger responsibilities on medicine, pensions, all of that stuff. They've meanwhile got quite a high unemployment rate. They're no longer publishing the figures for youth unemployment, not a good sign. When they stopped publishing, it was at 20% urban youth unemployment. So it's not great. So the bet is that these transition technologies and advanced manufacturing will, be the next iteration of growth in the Chinese economy. There are a number of problems with the way the Chinese kind of do their planning. One is that they set their GDP growth as a target rather than revealing it as a result. So we're now on 5%. So people do all manner of things to try to get their numbers up to that target, and some of those are productive. A lot of them are not. It would be much better actually to let investment go where it needs to go or wants to go and where it gets a return. So what you get instead is, for example, in Chinese electric vehicles, hugely successful sector. They're way ahead of everybody. They're doing them cheaply. They're really good. Every province has a Chinese electric car company. And so you get this explosion of companies in a new field, and they all get pretty good. And then there's a savage price war. And 40% of them go bankrupt. Now, this is quite wasteful, but that's where we are now. So if you look at there's a deflationary trend right now in China, and the profits on the industrial economy, which in every other respect is doing okay, they're razor thin or negative. So you prepare for a wave of bankruptcies. Now, you add to that the fact that the US was China's biggest export market, and there's a problem there. So you get these kind of crazy figures where tariffs are lifted and everybody, kind of ramps up the factory and starts to get the goods onto ships in order to get them there before the tariffs go down, So you can't trust the figures right now, is what I'm saying.
I'm envisioning this future where there will soon be enough electric vehicles for everybody in the United Kingdom to have electric vehicles as well.
At least 2, yeah.
I kind of want to ask you a question about U.S. Treasury bills, but I'm going to get to that maybe in the geopolitics section when it comes to sort of who's holding what cards. But Vincent, the countries on China's periphery are now under much stronger economic and commercial influence from China? Or maybe, well, are they under, I should put this as a question really, are they under more economic and commercial pressure and influence from China than they are or have been from the United States? And what is the dynamic of that shift?
I think so. Yes, I think they are under enormous Chinese economic influence. But this has always been there. China's existence, given its geography, given its demographics, given its size of economy, has always been very influential. Especially if you go to Southeast Asia, everywhere you go has some pull from China, has something to do with China, right? So this has always been there. And I just, so in response to what Isabel said, it is true that China's economy is sagging at the moment. By the way, we also recently did, this week we did a story about Chinese EV price war. If you're interested, go to npr.org. Sorry about the plug.
We're also supporting NPR.
Thank you for the opportunity. But China's economy is sagging. It might be declining. The growth rate is declining. But at the same time, its influence is also growing. Especially if you think about the trust deficit in Washington these days. I think there's a lot going on. When it comes to China in the region, the two things can be true at the same time. The economy is sagging, but the influence is still growing.
Could I just add to that?
Yes, of
which I completely agree with, that although the tariff war is bad for the Chinese economy, it's very good for the politics, because everything that happens in China that is negative can now be blamed on Donald Trump. And that's a serious asset for Xi Jinping.
And so, Vincent, what is it that compensates if there is a certain sort of diminishment in economic power or influence? What is it then that's sort of changing the dynamic among countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, all along Southeast Asia? Is there a military component to that? Is it geopolitical? How does a diminished economic footprint show up in increased influence?
Diminished economic footprint from the US or from China?
For China.
For China. Well, I think, if you go to the region these days, there's a real sense, there's a lot of kind of talk these days, which I was very surprised from my recent trip there, about this whole changing world order. Not something that we talk about in the US as much as we should, I think, but there's a real sense that the whole world is changing, and the world order is changing, therefore the region order is changing. There's a lot of championing from Singapore to, Cambodia, obviously it's usual suspect, but, Malaysia, Indonesia, talking about multipolar world. What does that mean? America is definitely going to be a pole. And in fact, many countries in that vast and diverse region want American presence because they also want to keep China's power in check. They've lived with China for a long time. They know how to navigate this. But they're also very keen in championing China becoming another pillar. And this is also something that China wants to do, becoming an important player, becoming a pillar in the multipolar world. And obviously there's India, how India is, where India is headed, we actually do not know. There's a lot of wishful thinking, in my view, from Washington, D.C., that kind of projecting what India wants instead of asking India what they want for themselves.
You must be thinking, we'll get to this maybe in the geopolitical section, you must be wondering that, Xi Jinping and Putin are probably just sort of sitting there with their arms crossed, sort of letting Trump do all of the sort of sledgehammer and wrecking ball work to the global order without them having to lift, exaggerating a bit, without them having to do too much effort. On the subject of wrecking balls and sledgehammers, let's talk about security for a second. Vincent, I want to stay with you because, if I'm not mistaken, Pete Hegseth did a Southeast Asian tour not too long ago. And he told the region that he wanted to emphasize the U.S. presence in the area. How did that go down?
It went down fairly well because, this is the kind of rhetoric that the region has been hearing over and over again, right? So if you think about Barack Obama in 2011, he made this big announcement in Australia about pivot to Asia. So America has for a long time been trying to reassert its dominance, influence at least, in the region. And, countries will have to recalibrate or calibrate their strategies. And this time around, I think there's a general sense of confusion in the sense that, yes, American defense secretary came to the region to reassert America's dominance, but at the same time, these countries are also looking at what is happening back in Washington. There's general sense of kind of confusion, given what's the drama, the kind of a reality TV type of plot after plot happening, and they are also watching very, very closely. So they wanted, yes, America is keenly trying to reassert its dominance in the region, but then everything could change if there's any changes in Washington D.C.
So, Stephanie, lots of talk about unreliability, change, and stability. Is there any benefit anymore to being an ally of the United States? Does it give you a security umbrella? Is it reliable anymore?
Well, the big problem with the Trump administration is the number of mixed signals coming out of Washington at this point. It's really hard to know what they want. And you're right, there are a lot of China hawks within the Trump administration who see China as the main threat. They want to move resources from Europe, and it's part of the reason why they've done this sort of light touch response to Putin, because they don't view Putin as a real threat. They view China as a real threat. Yet they're also talking in a way that undermines the sort of alliances and friendships that they've developed over years since the end of the Second World War in Asia. They've talked about reducing the U.S. troop presence in South Korea. Traditionally, if you were a U.S. ally, it meant, deterrence, a degree of intelligence sharing, and some stability at least. And I don't think that's part of the game anymore. He's completely torn up the script. Now, I think for countries like South Korea and Japan, they have such tight security relationships with the U.S. that it's going to be very hard to replace that. Their defense architecture is deeply integrated with the U.S. You do see South Korea expanding weapons production. You do see Japan, I believe, expanding defense spending. But then it gets mixed up with all these trade wars. And I do think there is this sense that China is actually emerging as the more reliable, predictable partner. But as you said, they want the U.S. presence there as a kind of counterbalance to China's power and influence. They're worried about being too economically dependent on China. But I think it's going to be very hard for them to choose between the two sides. I mean, they've been more or less trying to hedge their bets and kind of maintain this non-aligned path so that they don't have to pick sides in the sort of war.
They've explicitly said we do not want to pick a side, right? But there's also a sense if you listen to the Singaporean foreign minister back in, I think, on June the 7th, he was in Washington, D.C. and gave a really interesting speech. Basically, he said that the old way of doing business is over. So we have to rethink about what the new world order is going to look like and what does that mean for Southeast Asia. The other thing I wanted to add is that I think it is unfair to blame everything on the current U.S. administration. And in fact, America's dominance, America's kind of significance in the region has been kind of reducing for some time. America has for a long time been a humbler but still a superpower.
Stephanie, you talked about South Korea at a number of moments in your comments, and if this was a Middle East panel discussion, we might be talking about this, but because it's an Asia conversation, we can talk about this again. And South Korea, Isabel, was recently talking about a nuclear weapons program.
Yeah.
And does this in this vacuum, and particularly with North Korea and with China, and with this sort of with the United States essentially sort of resigning as the global sheriff, is the only source of security now in South Korea or elsewhere to have the bomb?
Well, I think there's a serious danger that is how people will think, because after all, both Japan and South Korea could have a bomb very easily. They have the technology and it wouldn't take very long. They haven't needed to. They haven't wanted to because they had extended deterrence. They had the United States. And, you can't change geography, but you can temper the effects of geography with politics and with strategy. And that was the case also for Vietnam, after all, which has had a pretty antagonistic relationship with China for 2,000 years. But, you know, you can't, there's not much you can do about your geography. But with the United States as a kind of reliable and sympathetic buffer, you can manage it. You're not going to be kind of at the mercy of Beijing. It's different. South Korea is in a very difficult situation because, you know, the nuclear power in the region, of course, is North Korea. And North Korea is having its moment because of Putin. You know, you look at two people who are completely isolated in terms of world opinion. And, well, Trump partly facilitated the return to the global stage of Kim Jong-un. You know, remember the exchange of love letters and all of that? I remember actually arriving in Singapore, their meeting, and I got in, was in the taxi from the airport and asked the driver, you know, had anyone arrived? And he said, yeah, it's the one with the strange hair. And I thought, that doesn't help. He didn't know which one it was. But anyway, so that came to nothing. But he's really kind of flexing his muscles because in exchange for supplying troops to Russia to service Russia's effort in Ukraine, the assumption is that he's getting a lot of help from Russia on his ballistic program and his nuclear program. And there have also been very hostile noises towards South Korea lately. So what's South Korea to do? You know, I think that certainly that's a very, very active conversation in both South Korea and Japan. And the lessons of countries that give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees is not great. No. You know, I mean, I won't list them.
Yeah. Stephanie, maybe just a quick insert on Russia and North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, clearly Putin has strengthened North Korea. He has withdrawn Russian support for the UN sanctions for North Korea. He has provided oil and food and probably technology for its conventional missiles, but potentially nuclear. So it has bolstered North Korea's position, and I think it has contributed to this insecurity in the southern part of the peninsula. And that started under Biden, but I think it's very much, you know, there's been no response from the Trump administration, and it's part of Trump's sort of handling Putin with kid gloves and worried about offending him and worried about dialing up sanctions on him because he might, you know, not come to the table. He's not coming to the table anyway. Right. So, you know, these are interconnected. And, you know, you now see North Korea bailing out Russia because it has a massive labor shortage and sending North Korean workers to Russia. Of course, you had these North Korean troops in Kursk helping the Russians retake that territory from the Ukrainians. You know, and suffering huge casualties. But that was really a test ground for the North Koreans, for their military, because they hadn't had any real life fighting experience. So I think the whole thing has really strengthened North Korea's position.
So if we've got Russia, we've got China, we've got Washington, we've got all of Southeast Asia. So this is a good way to just sort of segue into the geopolitics block, following on from economics and security. And also before we go to Q&A, Isabel, if I could start this section with you. I'm assuming, so correct me if I'm wrong, that China actually doesn't want to rule the world and doesn't want to be the global sheriff or a global sheriff. That said, China's doing everything it can in terms of new multilateral agencies and organizations. Feel free to mention the BRICS here if you feel like it. We'll get to that maybe as part of the geopolitics block. But China's doing everything it can to sort of dislodge the Western order. But it doesn't want to really rule the world, does it?
No, I think that's right. But what it wants to do is to limit the capacity of the United States to rule the world. And it wants to rewrite the global rules which it maintains were written in favor of the United States and other liberal democracies after the war, to rebalance that, as it would put it, into a more democratic system in which the majority world has more of a say.
It's an interesting twist on the word democratic.
Indeed, there are many in the Chinese lexicon interesting twists on democratic, and that is one of them. And we haven't paid a lot of attention in our kind of looking at China over a number of years to the diplomatic initiatives that China has promoted, invented, curated. As its importance in the global economy grew, it has become a kind of major, it has created enormous spheres of influence, which are not just about being the biggest provider of infrastructure or the biggest trade partner. They're also to do with Chinese-led entities. So you might begin with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, which was one of the earliest ones, which was partly to stabilize the Central Asian border after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet republics became independent, implications for Xinjiang, and so on. So SCO, begins as a kind of straightforward security one, but then you get the BRICS, you get China as a kind of near Arctic power, you get FOCAC, in which every African country except for Eswatini, is it the one I can never remember? That one, Eswatini, which recognizes Taiwan. Every other African country is a member of FOCAC, the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation. There's the China CELAC Cooperation, which covers Latin America and the Caribbean. There are a whole series of new normative initiatives. So the Global Defense Initiative, the Global Cultural Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative. And they're sort of all there. So it's changing the discourse. It's getting language into UN kind of statements and documents. And although it doesn't want to be the global policeman, it has a powerful blocking power these days on, for example, resolutions critical of China's human rights record, or sanctions regimes, or anything that would affect either its interests directly or its interests of its closest ally, Russia. So all of that is a kind of sphere of influence that we haven't really paid attention to, but it is beginning to function. It's a very different use of power from the United States, but it's quite effective.
It's interesting you mentioned all these initiatives. Remember AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank,
it's still there.
Was set up in 2012. And, Barack Obama, the Obama administration at the time, tried to dissuade the Cameron administration not to join that. But actually, in the lead up to it, because I was covering every year I was covering the IMF World Bank annual conferences. There's in the lead up to this, there was a lot of these discussions about, the Chinese frustration that the U.S. Congress will never pass this bill that allowed China to increase its voting share in the WTO.
Yeah,
so sometimes I do wonder, what if that was not the case? What if China was embracing to these organizations? We still see these parallel institutions that are now competing with existing institutions.
Possibly, although I suspect that the confrontation would have come in the end, because after all, China was invited into the WTO, and the results were kind of very good for China, but not that good for a lot of other countries. So I think that the moment would have come when the United States began to see China as an important strategic challenge and began to kind of try and slow the development in advanced technologies, for example. I suspect that was inevitable, might have been better managed. But I think the point about China wanting to be a different kind of power is important. It wants to be a new normative power, so to change the kind of the global rules, which in fact the United States has abandoned anyway. But it doesn't want to destroy the system, whereas I think Russia doesn't really care. But China has benefited from the global system. It just wants it to work more to China's advantage than it does at the moment.
Before we move on to Stephanie and a couple of questions about the U.S., indulge the moderator for half a second. How much weight do you assign to Beijing's holdings in T-bills as a source of leverage globally?
Well, I mean, the question is, if you were to sell them, you would crash everybody's economy. So, so it's a kind of double-edged sword. But I do think it's worth watching the combined efforts, which you can see in the BRICS, to develop a trading system which doesn't depend on the dollar. So it's relatively small at the moment, and we're nowhere near replacing the dollar. However, they are devising more and more kind of, direct swaps or kind of mediated currency arrangements, which will build. And I think that's a trend that's not going to reverse itself.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, more American questions, and forgive me, I'm capitalizing on your accent, I suppose, but also on your expertise. Joe Biden, when he talked about geopolitics, he talked about alliances. and he would openly, publicly call countries friends. Trump has turned all of that on its head. And I think even most dramatically, really, and most sort of frustratingly, perhaps, in the case of Japan, perhaps the U.S.'s greatest ally in the region. What's happened in this sort of inversion from, friends are now enemies, enemies are now friends? What has that done to the dynamics of the region?
Right, and remember, under the Biden administration, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen coined this term friendshoring.
Yes.
That the way to decouple from China was to prioritize trading relationships with U.S. allies, including Japan. Trump has obviously torn that up. He's very transactional and confrontational, even with the U.S.'s oldest, ally in East Asia and one of its biggest trading partners. He just announced today that he could put additional tariffs on Japan. The big sticking point has been that he thinks that Japan isn't importing enough U.S.-made cars. They imposed, high tariffs on Japanese autos. Of course, these big monster U.S. cars don't really work very well in Japan, so that's a problem. Then there's been this sticking point over Japanese unwillingness to import U.S. rice is another one, which of course is a very sensitive political issue in Japan. So, it is very sad to see that he is treating, a U.S. ally, a very strong member of the G7, notably, part of the sanctions coalition against Russia, and, froze Russian central bank assets in the wake of the 22 invasion, is really part of that kind of close G7 group that Biden really revitalized, or was revitalized as a result of the Russia war. And I think it just feeds into this overall sense that the U.S. just can't be trusted. I mean, we had it once, we had Trump 1.0, and now, who knows, even if after another 3 years, I don't think there'll be much faith that we will return to normal, so to speak. That, maybe there'll be a Democratic president who will revert to alliances and partnerships and friends, but we could easily end up with J.D. Vance, and then who knows where things go. He has been dumping on allies, notably Europe. So, I don't think there's any predictability anymore in the U.S., and I think that's huge. That has huge ramifications for the world order.
And, no matter who succeeds Trump, whether it's J.D. Vance or a Democrat, it's so much easier to break things than it is to put them back together again, and to sort of repair and build trust and things. Vincent, I know you wanted to jump in, but I'm going to also put a question on top of that, because in some of our conversations before this evening, you'll be familiar also with the concept of swing states, and that is sort of states in the United States who could vote one way or the other in the Electoral College in the general elections for president. Vincent familiarized me with the concept of swing states in Asia. Go ahead with your comment, but also explain to us geopolitically, what does a Southeast Asian swing state mean and do?
Well, I think, every time I think about swing states in Southeast Asia in particular, I think about the case of Myanmar. If you remember more than a decade ago, 2010, 11, 12, right? There was a big thing about Myanmar, opening up Myanmar. The country finally came out of the shadow of military rule, and we had a democratically elected party, leadership was Aung San Suu Kyi. And then the hope was that with Myanmar's strategic location, the West can capitalize on that. And obviously that will have geopolitical implications on China. So, that was the kind of swing states I've been thinking about. But look at where Myanmar stands now, right? We have this military coup, this civil war, and Aung San Suu Kyi is locked up in jail. And what the future holds for this strategically important part of Asia is still unknown. But, across the region, you also have countries like, Singapore, Indonesia, these countries. But with what is happening now, and especially on top of the US has already become a humbler superpower, and now with this trust deficit, what is going to happen to, if we put them, sort of give them a task to have a vote what would they do? I think to some countries, it will be quite clear where they are headed in terms of their voting preference. But I was going to make a comment on top of Stephanie's very astute remark. Was that I think she talked about world order. I think she's very right in on that track of thinking. I was thinking about what is going to happen to WTO, World Trade Organization, GATT, right, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. These were set of rules that had been in place for countries to trade normally in order for the whole world trading system to be more efficient and effective. So now you have this unilateral hiking and reducing of tariffs. So what kind of implication are we talking about for these existing trade regimes, and what kind of disruption will it cause to the whole global trading order? It's not just a world order in a geopolitical sense, but also in the trading order, in the economic efficiency sense.
For anybody who encountered a traffic jam in central London this afternoon, it was in part because of the tourists are back, but also there was a massive supply chain conference in London this morning and this afternoon, where nearshoring and friendshoring and reshoring and onshore, all of this different shoring came up, and there is a very, very large group of confused supply chain managers in central London today, trying to figure out exactly the questions that you've been raising and what's going to happen with the World Trade Organization and these constants that they have been relying on for so many years in building these incredibly complex and long supply chains that crisscross borders everywhere. I've seen over the course of the evening nodding heads in the audience. I've seen shaking heads in the audience, which means that we're getting a reaction. So why don't we just sort of place the discussion for the time being a little bit on hold and go to Q&A. We've got a roving microphone. We have a lot of questions. Okay, great. We've got a roving microphone. I just ask you for one favor, and that is please stand up, tell us who you are, ask your question, and then very kindly please be seated again. Thank you for your consideration in advance. Gentlemen in the glasses, will come to everybody. Keep your hands up or raise your hands after each question. Gentlemen in the glasses.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, my name's Nick. So I just had a question really about China's perspective. I just wanted the panel's input on how much do you think the Chinese leadership have come to the decision that all they can do with the US, especially under Trump and probably future administrations as well, is to placate them. We've spoken a lot about, the US and mentioned obviously the trade deals, 90 trade deals in 90 days, and obviously skeptical about that. But we haven't really delved into what China is doing in terms of trade, for example, with global South developing countries. A few weeks ago, essentially all tariffs were dropped between China and Africa. And, people can say, well, not particularly important right now, but African countries, for example, Nigeria is going to be the third most populous country in the world in 2050. So China is kind of preparing the ground. And I'm wondering if that is partly because they've come to the decision that they can't deal with the United States under this administration in any reasonable way.
Thank you. Open to the panel. Placating Trump, China's position.
I think it's certainly symbolic, right? I don't know what real effect it will have because, China still trades with the US very heavily. US is, certainly one of the largest trading partners with many countries around the world, including many in Africa. But certainly it is symbolic. It's a show of goodwill gesture. And I don't know how geopolitically it will lead to, but certainly it wouldn't be negative in my view. Isabel, do you?
I don't think that China is placating the United States. I mean, they played it pretty tough over strategic minerals and rare earths. And, the US has abandoned the processing of those things many years ago, despite the fact that they're necessary for everything, including military technologies. So, China has a very strong card, which it is absolutely prepared to deploy. Part of its difficulty with the US is the one that everybody has, is what is it the US wants? That, what is the reasonable ask? And that's pretty tough. in terms of China's trading relationship with the rest of the world, that's been building for years. And one of the difficulties that China's encountering now is that it's not just advanced economies that are getting very alarmed as China moves up the value chain and is, you know, threatening the industrial economy of Germany, for example, which is never politically a good thing to do. But it's not just Western Europe, it's Turkey, it's Mexico. I mean, there are a number, indeed many countries in Africa that have their own industrial economies, not as advanced as China's, but they can be wiped out by free trade with China. So China needs to find markets. You know, that's what they bet the farm on. But it's complicated. And it's complicated because China doesn't fit easily into the global trading system because the domestic economy is premised on very different, you know, conditions. And no one has entirely found an answer to that.
There's a gentleman who's had his hand up very dutifully in the front, right here in the front. We're going to come to you in 2 seconds. First, I just wanted to turn to Stephanie for a second. Trump will not be placated, will he?
He certainly won't let anyone. He won't let on that he's being placated. But I think he wants to portray whatever deal he does with China as fair and a win for the U.S. But the reality is that there is a need for targeted tariffs on China. Let's face it. China has overcapacity in manufacturing, and I believe the figure I read recently was that China's manufacturing capacity surplus grew by like $1 trillion since the trade war began. So clearly what the U.S. is trying to do is not helping matters. It's only exacerbating them. And the way he's going about the tariff war with China with these across-the-board tariffs is not the smart way to do it. It's not the way to achieve the goals he wants. But I think he will try to sell whatever deal that he does as a win if we get details of what they've worked out.
Great, Stephanie, thank you for that. Now, the gentleman in the second row.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum. I reviewed for Chatham House the original edition of Tim Marshall's Prisoners of Geography. He is still on top form with the new edition. I would urge everybody to try and read it and hear him, just as we have with following Putin, right? My question, I've also got Ghost Fleet downloaded on my Kindle. Again, I would urge everybody to look at that one. But my question is the countries of the Malay Barrier and controlling the sea routes. And I mean, this goes back to 1942. Where do these countries, above all Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, for obvious reasons, where do they see their military capabilities and allies' capabilities fitting in with the trade issue regarding confronting or accommodating China? How does everything join up? Which I think is very complex.
Great, thank you very much for that. Countries around the periphery and military calculations.
Convoluted complexity. It is indeed.
Beautiful.
Every country has the aspiration to modernize their military. But you have a dominant player that is China. And you also have the United States. Don't forget the US still spends a lot more than China militarily every year, even though China's military spending is increasing every year. Indeed, and that's the new frontier for competition between US and China now, shipbuilding, right? And then you also have all these, underlying crises bubbling up in the region. So how these countries, including Japan, which has the aspiration to play a much bigger role in case of a potential conflict between China and the US in the region, how are they going to navigate this new reality? I think that's, yes, like you said, must be a very, very complicated reality.
So on Indonesia, which is the country I know better than others just because I went there, was it 7 years ago, to do a story about Trump's business partner, an Indonesian billionaire called Harry Tano. I won't attempt to pronounce his full last name. So Indonesia appears to be in the front of the queue for a trade deal with the US. And I noted that the Indonesian president was the only world leader that showed up in St. Petersburg for the St. Petersburg Economic Forum with Putin. Yes. I read that as Indonesia being quite worried about China and trying to make sure it has enough friends and a backup plan. And I do know that that is an ongoing concern with sort of standoff in the South China Sea. And I expect that Harry Tano will be using his relationship with Trump behind the scenes to make sure that Indonesia gets treated fairly at the least, or if not, a good deal.
More questions? The gentleman in the green t-shirt.
Hi, Jonathan Fink, host of Silicon Curtain podcast. Hi. What role in this struggle between China and America does the race for AI supremacy play, and the race for obviously the manufacturing capability and the resources required to power that?
Everyone jump in.
Pretty central, I would say. It's the Chinese ambition to dominate those technologies, but also to develop enough self-sufficiency that they can't be held hostage, because the counterparty to, as I'm sure you know, to their control of strategic minerals is that the US has imposed restrictions on the export of advanced technologies to China. So China is working on that sector. It's what DeepSeek was a kind of huge boost to morale. And every day there's some kind of announcement of a sort of breakthrough, either in quantum or whatever it is, from China. So it's hugely important for national prestige, but also the ambition of getting to the point where they can't be hurt, essentially, by sanctions of whatever kind. That's central.
Well, I can think of two things. One is, for developing sophisticated technology, after all, it's a wall of talents, right? So where China gets its talents and where the US gets its talents. And I think we're seeing this with all the immigration policy in the US, the chaos that unleashed. We're seeing, certainly with the people, the Chinese scientists I have spoken to, there's a growing number of people I have spoken to have shown willingness to relocate to China. And indeed, every day you see these sort of, the other day I saw something on the South China Morning Post, one of the greatest mathematicians from North America relocated to China. Somewhere else also went to China, and they were given, this sort of, high-level treatment, given a lab, and given lots of dedicated funding. And I think, in order for pursuing the AI supremacy, after all, this is about that, about talent, about innovation. The other thing I think, I keep thinking about, China AI. Yes, I think China does want the best technology for economic efficiency and also to outcompete the United States. But there's also a thing I feel, robots do not pay taxes, right? I mean, you are facing this demographic issue in China, and the unemployment rate is fairly high, and economy is sagging. So how do we square that circle? You still have that many people. China is a country of 1.4 billion people, and still quite a lot of the young people every year wanting to look for a job, and then they couldn't find one. And now the economy is becoming more efficient. And how do you get them to do the kind of job you want to do where the market no longer needs them? I think that's a question that may be a headache for policymakers in Beijing that they do not discuss openly about.
Yeah, I would just say that the open question in my mind is, has Trump relaxed any of those restrictions on advanced semiconductors to China? Because, I thought the Biden administration policy, I'm critical of many aspects of it, but I thought their strategy of trying to deny China access to those most sophisticated semiconductors and create this sort of tiered access, amongst countries to slow China down was wise. But it appears that Trump has completely trashed that whole strategy. The Trump administration is talking about selling advanced semiconductors to the UAE, which could be just a backdoor route to China. So I think he's messed the whole thing up. And I suspect with China playing tough on that deal, that perhaps they did relax some of those requirements. How far they went remains unclear.
When we do a Middle East panel, we'll have to talk about what it means to essentially outsource your AI capability to the Gulf by agreeing to build the world's largest data centers there, as opposed to somewhere else. Since we're in the business of plugging books, you've read Chip Wars, yeah? Okay, great. Everyone else, if you haven't, yeah, thumbs up. If you haven't, please do. We had some more questions on this side, the gentleman in the striped shirt, and then we'll come to you. Thank you.
Andre Rocky, I'm a member of West Mississippi Studies Group. 2 questions.
Okay, quick ones.
Right, quick ones. About, the results of the Russian-Ukrainian war, for Russia being more and more dependent on Chinese support, although it goes two ways, and more and more access to the Siberian resources by China. Russian opposition's complaints, where China is creeping and getting more and more. It's like 50% of the freshwater resources by calling the big Siberian rivers. Another one would be, we had a meeting with the Taiwan representative or ambassador here in London, and he mentioned if Taiwan was knocked out of production of nanochips, the immediate effect for the world budget would be like minus $10 trillion, like 2 yearly budgets of Germany. So is it a scenario that would benefit China if Taiwan was knocked out as a result of any conflict? And I don't mean like invasion, but as a result, ballistic missile, just knocking
Not
out.
an invasion, but a ballistic missile.
Blockade, perhaps.
Yeah, so there's 2 questions.
Yeah, okay, great. Perfect panel for both of those questions. I'll just open it up for whoever wants to jump in.
On TSMC, which is the company that you're talking about in Taiwan, a number of things are happening. TSMC is building facilities elsewhere. They're not as advanced as the ones in Taiwan, and they still, I think, maintain that they won't move the most advanced chips because it's the silicon shield. But to go back to the question of China's military intentions and military capabilities, there are a number of things going on. I mean, China's military capabilities are pretty unknown. They've spent a lot of money, they have a lot of kit, but they have very little experience. They do a lot of, war gaming. The last war they actually fought, they lost. That was with Vietnam in the 70s. And they have just purged, again, a whole series of very senior military people. So there's a kind of problem of trust within the armed forces. In any event, it's always seemed to me, but I was wrong about Putin, so I could be completely wrong about this, that the risks of a kinetic attack on Taiwan are just off the scale, not just to China, but to the rest of the world. And that over the past 25 years, China has got what it wants by a series of sub-conflict moves. So militarizing the entire South China Sea without a shot being fired, using things like Coast Guard vessels with high pressure, hoses, rather than having to, you get what you want. The question of blockade, Taiwan has approximately 14 days of LNG, stored, and it's very hard to build that up. So actually, it wouldn't take a lot. I mean, all you have to do is interrupt those supplies, and Taiwan's energy system is in deep trouble. There are all sorts of ways that pressure can be put on Taiwan, which don't actually affect TSMC. And if I were in Beijing, those are the things that I would be looking at. Because also, we don't have very good responses. The United States doesn't have good responses to any of those moves. You can imagine in war game a kind of military assault, but the other things, the constant, below the threshold attacks are much harder to deal with.
Shall we move this way across the panel to the Russia question?
Yeah, I think obviously Russia is now a client state to China and is very dependent on China. It's selling almost 50% of its oil to China, so that creates an immediate dependency. It hasn't been able to redirect Russian gas supplies that once went to Europe to China because it doesn't have the infrastructure in place, so that is a limiting factor. But China and Hong Kong have been a conduit for all the semiconductors that Russia's defense industry needs for producing precision-guided weaponry, and has remained that sort of loophole that Russia really needs. And it is a power imbalance. They've struck this no-limits partnership, which is very much in China's favor. I think China's the one, pulling the strings. But the recent visit by President Xi to Russia for the Victory Day parade, showed the ties closer than ever. There was quite a robust op-ed that Xi wrote for, I think, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian newspaper, state newspaper. That was he came out fully in support of Putin and called on world powers to view his invasion of Russia of Ukraine as something that should be resolved internationally, that they had a right to take this part of Ukraine. So I think it's a very worrisome development, and I think it's created more problems for Russia now, particularly because its economy is very weak and is dependent on the yuan, and so I think that gives China extra leverage. Boosting what?
Boosting Chinese economy. So I mean, the graph on Siberia and all the resources, the freshwater, rather like consequences for China, like pumping up their economy.
Yeah, I would say that's not.
Is it not right? Yeah.
I think I think the oil is probably more significant for China, that it's getting discounted Russian oil. The rest of that is more of a long game, I think, for China, and doesn't, given the size of the Chinese economy, I don't think it's having that much of an effect.
Okay, lots more questions. There's been a very patient lady in the front row here I'd like to come to, and then I see the questions on the side panel as well. Thank you for all your questions.
Thank you. I like being called patient, which these two know me. They know that that's not my characteristic. No. Bernice Lee, I work on sort of geopolitics, trade, and climate action in my day job. China is a hobby. On that last point, however, the interesting thing is that in all the projections I've seen, China is expected not to be import dependent at all on oil from 2040 onwards. It thinks that it's going to be utterly independent. So in some sense, if Russia had any sway on this, it's a short-lived one, 10 years, which is not nothing, but nonetheless, it's not a long-term hold. Gas is a different issue. My question is really for Isabel first, and then others if possible. You mentioned China is interested in normative power. Where do you think China is winning the normative war? Or is China winning any normative war? Secondly, for the rest of you, who do you think, I'm interested in the idea of cakeism, who is having the cake and eating it. Who do you think are the beneficiaries of the US-China rivalry at the moment? And what lessons can we learn from them?
Great questions, very much worth the wait. Thank you.
Normative war, certainly on human rights. It's been a long time since a resolution criticizing China on human rights got through anything, including the UN. But also the European Union or ASEAN, because, China's tactics where it can't be a member of something, it's to co-opt a small country. In the case of the European Union, it's Greece because of Piraeus. In ASEAN, it's Cambodia or Laos. So in those terms, it's changing those rules quite a lot, I think. Other ways in which it's changing.
Do you think of norms as being bigger than just the UN? I know that is.
No, I understand. Yeah, but I mean, it means it's changed the global discussion on human rights, I think. I mean, the US obviously contributed by its own behavior to that, but I think that China has capitalized on that. I think in terms of security, actually, the security discourse is also shifting. If you look at what China says about security, it sort of nudging towards the Russian position. So apparently kind of bland phrases like everybody's legitimate security must be taken into consideration means that if Russia feels that NATO's expansion is a threat, that needs the same consideration as, you know, Ukraine. So in those senses, China's actually changing the discourse, I think, quite a lot. And I don't think that's going to go back. I don't think we're going to see a reversion. I would watch out on religious freedoms for Dalai Lama questions coming up quite soon. And I think that you'll see that the world, you know, those rules that were pretty dominant for 50 years are no longer.
For the rest of the panel, who's winning out of all of this? Who's having their cake and eating it too? And one of the countries that we haven't spoken about, and I know you and I chatted about this, Vincent, is India.
India, indeed, yes.
Is India winning?
I think so. You know, in appearance, I think India is winning this war, if we put it that way. But I think India is certainly in this very sweet geopolitical spot, right? You know, it's a non-alliance doctrine. Their foreign policy is really, they're really, you know, reaping harvests, harvesting the benefits of it and the wisdom of it as well. India is also buying Russian oil. That gets much less headline from, you know, the fact that China is also buying Russian oil. And, you know, India is also having this really kind of nice moment with the United States. There's a lot of benefit of the doubt from Washington. If you look at recent kind of tackling of the Indian-Pakistan conflict, that short-lived conflict, and how on the Hill in Washington, D.C., these Congress people talk about this, that's, to me, is quite revealing and interesting. I do think, you know, India is striking an impression, and maybe it's genuine, that over time it will become allies, full-fledged allies of Western democracies. I think that question still remains open to me. My point is that there's a lot of, you know, maybe wishful thinking is too harsh of a phrase on that. There's a lot of projection of its own imagination in capitals like London and Washington about what India is going to look like 10, 20 years down the road. But we need to ask questions to Indians, let them tell us what exactly they want 10, 20 years down the road. They have their own agencies as well.
Great. Stephanie, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I just would say that Russia is probably the one who's winning. Despite the problems in the Russian economy, I think it's great for the Trump administration to view China as the principal threat and not Russia. That takes the heat off of Russia. And so I think Putin is loving this sort of US-China trade war. I think he certainly is the one who's benefiting.
Super. They were sitting comfortably on the banquette here on the side. We had two questions, and then we'll take those two questions, and I think then maybe we will head downstairs for something cold to drink. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. My name's Esther Hodges. I'm an independent researcher. I wonder if you could share some thoughts on what US-China relations at the moment means for the potential for cooperation on wicked, super wicked problems like climate change, like antimicrobial resistance, space debris, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, not rivalry issues.
Well, the chances of cooperation on climate change between the Trump administration, which regards it as a Chinese hoax, and Beijing are not good. UK, yes. I mean, that's a very active conversation, as it is with the European Union. There are a number of obstacles to do with security and Chinese technologies. But, you know, the principles of you know, China doesn't have a climate denial problem. It has a bit of a responsibility denial problem, but not a climate denial problem. China is very invested in mitigation efforts because that's its technological dominance. So for all sorts of reasons, China is talkable to on climate change. There hasn't been a lot of give in the Chinese position recently, at least for a while. The emissions have peaked, but that they've peaked too high. They probably won't come down very much, very quickly enough. So, you know, it's not great, but it's certainly an active conversation. In terms of other scientific effort, I think yes. I mean, we do cooperate. I don't know about the US. Vincent, you're in a better position to answer that.
Yeah,
but certainly in Europe and in the UK, there is active cooperation across a number of fields.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of cancer projects, right? Cancer research projects. And when it comes to climate change, maybe federal government is not so keen, the president may not be so keen on climate change as an issue, as a problem. But we should also look at, states level. California has been very active on that front, right, globally, not just, with China, but with other players as well. On scientific collaboration, I think, there are some projects existing. I cannot tell on top of my mind, but, the point I want to make is that in a world that everything, when it comes to US and China, in a world where everything is so politicized, they may eventually fall victim of politicization as well one day. That is very unfortunate.
Yeah, I would just say one of the things that was recently pointed out to me as part of the big, beautiful bill that just passed the Senate.
That's right, just one.
They snuck in this provision at the last minute that, if I can get this right, they imposed a tax on renewable energy projects in the US that would come in 2027 for projects that did not remove all Chinese components and supply chains, which I think is
impossible. Yeah.
Which is impossible. It's very hard to understand the rules, but I think that is very devastating, really, for China's renewable industry, because so much of it was going to the U.S. Obviously, it's terrible for U.S. renewable projects. I don't know how they will survive. And of course, at the same time, Trump, I think, introduced a tax break for coal. So I think the overall picture is not a good one.
Thank you. We're almost up against it time-wise. Is there one more question over there on the banquette?
Well, yes, with some embarrassment. I'm old, Ed Vulliamin. I don't want to follow an important question about the future by taking us back. But Vietnam is not very important in all this, but it's so iconic. And given our theme, it's the weirdest story in a way. When I was Mira's age, it was My Lai, it was napalm, and the reforging of American culture. Now, Trump Tower, Hanoi, you daren't oppose a golf course, his golf course, because the government is so keen to accommodate him. The friend with whom I was at the Battle of Grosvenor Square has a son who has the Budweiser franchise in Vietnam. It's a communist country. It has walked a high wire between Russia and China, and Russia in various forms in China. And I hate to end on a relative irrelevance, but iconically, if the Martians said, what's been going on since I was your age, I'd send them to Vietnam for the weirdest story. So just thoughts on that as a sort of symbolic irony of such extremes, please.
Well, I think, if you go to China in the 90s or early 2000s, right, you do have this kind of sense if you come directly from the outside, the kind of state ideology you learned about a country, in that case China, was very different from the reality in China you encounter. I do think when I went to Vietnam, it did strike me as something very similar. When I landed in Hanoi, even the air smelled quite similar to that in Shanghai in the early 2000s. Don't know how to explain this, but I think, a lot of Asian countries, they're actually very pragmatic. They have a state ideology, but they also have a reality to navigate. And usually, those who navigate the reality are the young people, the working class people. And they are very pragmatic, they are very enterprising. They want to make something out of very little. And I do think the momentum is there for Vietnam after so many years of being neglected, if not outright ignored. Biden went to Vietnam, I think, last year, and to reaffirm Americans' commitment to Vietnam. And if you want to talk about the trade war between US and China, actually Vietnam was one of the beneficiaries. Haiphong, for example, one of the towns in the country, has been benefited enormously. We recently did a story as well from Haiphong, and we interviewed these managers, who said they are struggling to find workers because there's just so much demand for manufacturing work, and they couldn't find enough people to help them with producing stuff.
But I view the Trump trade war against Vietnam, these massively high tariffs that they've tried to impose on Vietnam unless they can do a deal, it's just a tragedy given the damage that the U.S. military did to Vietnam for so long, that the legacy issues should have made the U.S. treat Vietnam differently than Trump did.
The legacy issues are important, and they are memorialized in Vietnam. There are people who are still suffering from the chemical impacts of what was dropped on Vietnam. But the Vietnamese see that war as an anti-colonial war, which they won. They were fighting US imperialism, they won, the US went away. The self-defensive counterattack, which is what the Chinese call their invasion of Vietnam a few years later, is a different story. Vietnam won, but China doesn't go away. That's the geography problem. So, as I said earlier, you can't change geography, but you can hedge its effects. And that's what they did.
Thank you. So we have come full circle, sort of historically and symbolically. And thank you for that last question that brought us there. Very happy to make a few thank yous before we all say goodbye. And that is, first of all, to the Frontline Club for being such fantastic hosts, and to Nina Watson and to Martin Mann for shepherding us through the event. Please, a round of applause. Thank you very, very much to everybody who's braved the heat and the extreme weather to join us here this afternoon. And please join me in thanking our panelists, Isabel, Hilton, Vincent Ni, and Stephanie Baker for their fantastic speech today. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Cool beverages downstairs. Very excited.